The LA protests this week highlight the horror that is being inflicted on immigrants at raids and also mundane procedural hearings alike. Much of the fuel for the Trump regime's anti-immigrant operations is being provided by Deputy White House Chief of Staff and Homeland Security Advisor Stephen Miller. But if you want to keep your job as a journalist, apparently you can't criticize him for his actions. Quote, "The thing about Stephen Miller is not that he is the brains behind Trumpism. Yes, he is one of the people who conceptualizes the impulses of the Trumpist movement and translates them into policy. But that's not what's interesting about Miller. It's not brains, it's bile. Miller is a man who is richly endowed with the capacity for hatred. He's a world-class hater. You can see this just by looking at him, because you can see that his hatreds are his spiritual nourishment. He eats his hate. Trump is a world-class hater, but his hatred is only a means to an end, and that end is his own glorification. That's his spiritual nourishment." End quote. That is the post that led to the termination of ABC News reporter Terry Moran, anchor for ABC News Live, a senior national correspondent, previously the network's chief foreign correspondent, and a journalist for ABC News since 1997. Nearly 30 years of dedicated journalism, and he's sacked for calling out authoritarian leaders for being world-class haters. Reminder that ABC News is also the network that settled a defamation lawsuit it could have handily won against Trump and agreed to give $15 million to the Trump Presidential Library Fund. Moran has since deleted the post and has not commented further on the issue. After suspending his work at the network on Sunday, ABC issued a statement on Tuesday declaring that they had officially fired Moran. Since the free speech of journalists is actively being stymied by major news networks intent on bending the knee to the Trump regime, which is likely further chilling the speech of journalists around the world who would speak out against the atrocities being committed under his eye, but for the fear of losing their jobs, I consider it, frankly, my patriotic duty to engage in as much Stephen Miller bashing as humanly possible. So I'd like to say the following, and without fear of my livelihood being taken away, I'll note that for legal reasons what I'm about to say is all just my opinion. Stephen Miller is a world-class hater. Stephen Miller is a creep. Stephen Miller is ugly. He is an unattractive person. Stephen Miller looks like his breath stinks. Stephen Miller was a loser even before his hairline started to recede. Stephen Miller was that kid in high school who was a hopeless dweeb, and instead of gaining a sense of humor and a personality like the rest of us did to cope with being unpopular, he decided to turn to hatred and bigotry to cover up the pain of being disliked and ignored. He says hateful, horrible shit because he has no interesting or original ideas. Stephen Miller has spent his life reading about the hateful ideology of others and perfecting his ability to regurgitate the most vile ideas that someone else has come up with in order to gain attention. Stephen Miller hates himself so much that he cannot contain it. He must redirect it towards others so that other people can feel the deep hatred he also feels towards himself. Stephen Miller has struggled because he is an unattractive, socially awkward, small, balding man with an annoying voice and zero redeeming qualities. And so, like the tired trope in any villain story arc, he has let his pain turn him evil. And now we all have to live with the consequences of one insecure, vile man who couldn't get a girl to like him in middle school or some shit, and now wants the world to reflect back to him the empty, vacuous black hole inside of him. Doesn't that feel good? It has been interesting to watch the news of Terry Moran's firing being covered by the very news media that will be affected by the further erosion of free speech for journalists. This headline from The Independent caught my eye. ABC suspends reporter who interviewed Trump after devastating analysis of president and Stephen Miller. It's helpful to see in the Ground News browser extension that this publication leans left. So to get a fuller picture of the story, I can click on full coverage. On the Ground News website, I can see that 298 sources are covering this topic, with interpretations varying wildly depending on the bias of the publication. For example, left-leaning Daily Kos uses the headline, "Terry Moran suspended by ABC because of Trumpian political correctness," while right-leaning New York Post uses the headline, "Top ABC News correspondent goes on wild screed against top Trump advisor Stephen Miller." Depending on where you get your news, you're going to get very different takes on the same story, and if you only pay attention to one side or the other, you might miss the full picture of the national conversation happening around the issue on all sides of the spectrum. This is where Ground News comes in and why I've been using them for over a year. Today's partner, Ground News, is an app and website that offers tools to help you critically analyze the news you read, providing context to understand the full picture. By using the Ground News Vantage subscription, I can also see the blind spot feed, where I can see stories disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. For example, 0 right-leaning sources are covering the story, "Trump administration to end DHS program designed to thwart terror attacks." Interesting. I feel better equipped to make sense of what's happening in the world without being influenced by just one perspective. And listen, I'm not the only one who loves ground news. The Nobel Peace Center even called it an excellent way to stay informed, avoid echo chambers, and expand your worldview. I'm really impressed with ground news and genuinely think they're a great resource. If you want to stay informed on US politics and more, subscribe through this QR code or the link below at ground.news/Leeja for 40% off this unlimited access Vantage plan. It comes out to $5 a month for unlimited access to all the features I've mentioned. Thanks, Ground News. Stephen Miller was that kid in school who read Ayn Rand and the Federalist Papers and decided he was now the expert on all things conservative, and it was his duty to be as loud as possible about every quote-unquote injustice he saw unfolding around him as a persecuted foot soldier of the conservative cause, whether it was real or made up. He wrote angry letters to any publication that would listen and showed up to any town hall or community meeting he could to rant about how his school, diverse Santa Monica High School, wasn't properly raising the flag or saying the Pledge of Allegiance, how the Latino members of his high school should learn English, how students shouldn't have to clean up after themselves because that's what janitors are for, how some students had parents whose only useful skill was to be janitors.
I will say and I will do things that no one else in their right mind would say or do. Am I the only one who is sick and tired of being told to pick up my trash when we have plenty of janitors who are paid to do it for us?
His senior quote was from Theodore Roosevelt, saying, quote, "There can be no 50-50 Americanism in this country. There is room here for only 100% Americanism, only for those who are Americans and nothing else." Reminder that Stephen Miller is a fourth-generation immigrant, and Teddy Roosevelt would have said that quote sometime around the same time his great-grandmother would have been pulling up to Ellis Island in 1906. One of Stephen Miller's former middle school friends told NPR, quote, "I see where he is now as a teenage rebellion that metastasized into a kind of pernicious, illiberal, exclusionary ideology." He began appearing on talk radio while still in high school, a sort of wonderkind child prodigy freak, but for bigotry, that the radio hosts got a real kick out of. In college at Duke, he wrote conservative columns for the school newspaper, accused Maya Angelou of racial paranoia, and called a Chicano student group a, quote, "radical national Hispanic group that believes in racial superiority," which literally doesn't make any sense given that the term Hispanic doesn't represent any single nation or race. After college, he took his anti-immigrant conservative ideology on the road, first as press secretary for Michelle Bachmann, then communications director for then-Senator Jeff Sessions. He played a major role in forming Sessions' anti-immigrant policy, including the creation in 2015 of the Immigration Handbook for the new Republican majority, which was created with Jeff Sessions as a rebuttal of the RNC's less extreme immigration policy. And in 2016, he signed on to Trump's presidential campaign as senior policy advisor. Once in the White House, good old Steve was senior advisor to the president for policy, but he mainly focused on immigration. He worked with Steve Bannon and Jeff Sessions to write the original Muslim ban and pushed for other anti-immigrant policies like the end of DACA, family separation, reducing asylum entries, and more. He also controlled the press and communications coming out of the White House about immigration, reportedly stopping any publication of studies from agencies about the benefits of immigrants in the country. He worked to get non-loyalists fired from key positions, and when COVID hit, he wanted to use the emergency as an excuse to militarize and shut down all borders. When Trump lost in 2020, old Stevie was right there to push election denial and advocated for alternate slates of electors to try to overthrow the election. When that didn't work, he got down to business to prepare for the next election. And honestly, that 4-year window between Trump administrations was probably to his advantage, as he was able to spend that time to become better prepared to hit the ground running the next time a willing Republican took the White House. What we're seeing play out now is a direct result of that planning. In 2021, he founded the America First Legal Foundation, which contributed to Project 2025. The foundation filed numerous lawsuits over immigration, affirmative action, trans rights, and more, and developed legal strategies that are now being implemented on a national scale. Miller is the key official behind Trump 2.0's Flood the Zone strategy. He was behind most of the executive orders Trump signed on day one, and most of the ones he's signed since, especially regarding immigration. Attorney General Pam Bondi, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, and Director of of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, largely implement whatever Stephen Miller demands. And I have no doubt Stephen Miller was behind the executive order Trump issued over the weekend, sending in the National Guard to quell the LA protests, as Steve has also had it out for sanctuary cities for a very long time, and that executive order was clearly just waiting on his desk to be sent when the time was right. Despite the onslaught of anti-immigrant propaganda, executive actions, and ICE raids, Stephen Miller is still unhappy with the state of immigration in America. He reportedly called a meeting last week to screech at top ICE officials for failing to meet his goal of 3,000 deportations a day, yelling, "Why aren't you at Home Depot? Why aren't you at 7-Eleven?" Steve has known since high school that optics matter, and you can do a lot of work behind the scenes while telling people what they want to hear. He once told a high school classmate, quote, "The truth doesn't matter. It's about what people want to hear." And so while touting the goal to get rid of the quote unquote worst of the worst criminal terrorist immigrants, behind the scenes, he wants 3,000 deportations a day, no matter who those people are, no matter their criminal status, no matter their legal status, as long as they're brown. Because to Stephen Miller, his work won't be done until America is all white, because Stephen Miller is a white nationalist. In emails leaked to the Southern Poverty Law Center in 2019, he repeatedly bemoaned all non-white immigration, saying that non-white immigration was a threat to white people, saying that immigration of non-white people should be outright banned. And the Trump regime's response to the protests in LA is a direct result of Stevie's white nationalism. As Salon recently pointed out, quote, "Even if the Trump administration met its unlikely goal of deporting 11 million people, this would still be a racially diverse country by any measure. And it's becoming more diverse. The non-white population is younger and having more children. MAGA Republicans flip out when liberals correctly point out that diversity is America's strength. But what really makes them crazy is knowing deep down that diversity is America's inevitability." This impotent rage factor is important for understanding what's happening in Los Angeles. Trump and Miller can't achieve their whites-only dreams, so they're lashing out violently at communities, like in Southern California, that remind them of their powerlessness in this department. The problem, unfortunately, is that Stephen Miller is going to try as hard as he can to do it anyway, no matter who gets hurt, killed, or sent to CCOT in the process. And no matter how many of our tax dollars have to be thrown at the problem. And with the big, beautiful bill that passed in the House and is being debated in the Senate, Stevie is about to get a lot more dollars to play with in his dream of eviscerating all non-white populations in the U.S. According to reporting from Slate, quote, "The House-passed bill gives ICE another $45 billion to expand detention capacity, $14 billion on removal operations, and $8 billion to hire more ICE officers." And old Stevie knows that it's going to be a huge win for him, so he's pushing for the passage of the bill repeatedly. Last week, he posted on Twitter saying, quote, "The BBB will increase by orders of magnitude the scope, scale, and speed of removing illegal and criminal aliens from the United States. For that reason alone, it's the most essential piece of legislation currently under consideration in the entire Western world in generations." Quite the statement, especially considering that he knows, and we all know, that it won't just put dollars towards removing quote-unquote illegal and criminal aliens, but also brown people of all types, whether or not they're criminals, whether or not they're here legally, whether or not they're citizens. And so, using the protests in LA as pretext to send in the National Guard and then the Marines to escalate things further so they can further militarize a city full of immigrants, to maybe eventually invoke the Insurrection Act and put permanent military on the streets to terrorize a city of brown people whose very name, Los Angeles, isn't even in English, God forbid, that's exactly part of Stephen Miller's plan. I've seen a lot of people saying, no, what's happening in LA is a sign of weakness. It's a sign that they're scared because the people are rising up. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think it's a foreseeable outcome of sending in troops, and that escalation is exactly what men like Stephen Miller, who want to watch the world burn, want. The actions of the entire Trump regime are signs of weakness, don't get me wrong. It's a strongman government run by weak men who are ashamed of their own weakness and compensating for it through show of force. A lot of the atrocities we see throughout history are the result of impotent men lashing out because of their own mediocrity. Hitler had no personality or money or skill, but he had his imagined racial superiority, and so he used that to gain the power and notoriety that he could have never gained if he just relied on actual skill, hard work, or intellect. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, was similarly mediocre. He was born with a deformed club foot at a time when there was very little medical intervention available. He was unpopular with women. He yearned to be a writer but couldn't get published. accomplished. He didn't have any money, but he did have his imagined racial superiority. And so instead of developing a personality or any skills or just like finding a fucking hobby, he lobbed onto Hitler, riding the Nazi wave until the end of the war when he followed in Hitler's footsteps one final time, killing himself and his 6 children before the Soviets made it to their bunker. And so yeah, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, unfortunately. And the big beautiful bill is just going to add more fuel to the fire. This weekend, Saturday, is the No Kings National Day of Rallies to protest against Trump's military parade he's demanded in his honor on his birthday. Trump has vowed that any protesters at his parade will be met with force. Luckily, the No Kings rallies are scheduled for everywhere but Washington, D.C., because there's nothing these men hate more than being ignored. There also literally aren't enough troops to send them into every one of the 1,800 plus planned rallies across the country. Find your nearest rally at nokings.org. It's expected to be the largest mass mobilization since Trump took office. If you want to support my work, all my videos are completely ad-free and uncensored over on Patreon, patreon.com/LeejaMiller. Thank you to my multi-platinum patrons, Mark, Sarah Shelby, Travis, Art, David, RH, Latranger Lucas, Thomas Johnson, and Tay. Your generosity makes this channel what it is, so thank you. And if you like this episode, you like the one from yesterday, all about the protests in LA. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye!